Welcome, seekers of hidden truths in the shadows of time, to a new episode of Silent of History. Tonight, as the outside world slows and silence claims every corner, I invite you on a very particular journey. A journey that, as you delve into its details, might make you infinitely grateful for your clean pillow, your warm shower, and the simple act of breathing without an unbearable stench. We're going to dismantle myths. We're going to strip away the romantic image we sometimes paint of the Middle Ages. Because while it was an era of knights and castles, of faith and great epics, it was also, let's be brutally honest, a period where hygiene, as we know it today, was practically non-existent. And not just non-existent, but often dangerous. Imagine for a moment, not just the dust of the roads, but also the persistent smell of urine, human and animal feces, bodies unwashed for weeks or months, clothes that accumulated dirt, and parasites day after day. A world where the simple act of drinking water could be Russian roulette, and where a simple scratch could become a death sentence by infection. Prepare for a story that, with the calm of the night and the weight of history, will immerse you in a reality that very few dare to show. A stinking reality, yes, but fascinating in its rawness. As the stars twinkle outside and the world settles into rest, let me unveil why your hygiene in the Middle Ages would be, frankly, simply disgusting. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. I'm Silent of History, and my goal is for this story to immerse you in a unique experience while you enjoy a good night's sleep. Tonight, we begin our journey by unveiling one of the most misrepresented images of the Middle Ages: bathing. For are the romantic scenes of castles with steaming baths and maidens washing with perfumed water. The reality, for the vast majority of the medieval population, was something else entirely. It was a sticky, foul-smelling truth, often fraught with invisible dangers. The first major barrier to any semblance of hygiene was the scarcity of water and fuel. Don't think of simply turning on a tap. Let's consider a peasant or artisan. In the 12th century, to heat a tub of water for a bath, a considerable amount of firewood or charcoal was needed. Fuel was a precious resource, vital for cooking, heating homes in icy winters, and for trades like blacksmithing or pottery. Imagine the effort. Hauling water, often from a distant well or river, which could already be contaminated, lighting a large fire, and keeping it going long enough for the water to even reach a lukewarm temperature in a wooden tub. This exhausting and costly logistics turned a full bath into a luxury event, a true feat that very few could afford regularly. For medieval men and women, every bucket of hot water was an investment of time and resources. Even the nobility, though more privileged, did not bathe daily. Charlemagne himself, famous for his fondness for thermal baths, inherited from the Roman tradition that he tried to revive, was an exception, not the rule. And even then, his baths were not with the frequency or standards we would consider today. And if the preparation was an odyssey, the act of bathing itself often did more harm than good. The communal baths that existed in some medieval cities were not the oases of cleanliness that our modern minds might conjure. They were, frequently, shared pools, large wooden tubs where multiple individuals immersed themselves in the same liquid again and again, without constant water changes. Imagine the scene. A man enters, shedding weeks, perhaps months, of accumulated dirt. Then another enters, and another. The water quickly became a murky broth, a soup of dead cells, sweat, germs, and, unfortunately, all kinds of bodily fluids. Far from purifying, these communal baths became a perfect breeding ground for the spread of skin diseases, infections, and, yes, also lice and fleas, which jumped from one body to another. In some cities, public baths ended up being centers of disease, and the church, moreover, viewed them with suspicion, considering them places of promiscuity and temptation. Documents from the time, such as municipal regulations, sometimes even regulated schedules for men and women, or directly tried to control or close them due to morality problems and, although they did not express it directly in terms of germs, due to obvious unhealthiness. Cities like Nuremberg, which were considered relatively clean for the time, did have public baths, but their success depended heavily on local management. The frequency of bathing was, by our standards, absolutely shocking. For the vast majority of the rural and urban population, a full bath might occur only once a month, once every few months, or even once or twice a year. Think of the chronicles. It is said, for example, that Cluniac monks bathed only twice a year, while Benedictines did so twice as often. Can you imagine living with that constant accumulation of sweat, dead cells, dust, body grease, and excretions? The smell must have been a constant and overwhelming presence. The upper classes could afford to bathe more frequently, perhaps to just weekly. But even for them, wooden tubs and shared water remained the norm. Isabella the Catholic, who was erroneously said to have bathed only twice in her life, a debunked myth, as she did have hygiene habits for her time, serves to illustrate that even among royalty, the notion of cleanliness was very different from ours. Given the impossibility of bathing with water, dry cleaning was resorted to, a rudimentary and not always effective alternative. This involved vigorously rubbing the body with cloths or linens, often dry, to remove superficial dirt and dead cells. It was a kind of body brushing, which, while helping to eliminate some visible grime and exfoliate the skin, did not eliminate bacteria or parasites. Some even used fine sand or ash for deeper exfoliation. And here comes the most surprising and perhaps nauseating part for the modern mind: urine. Yes, human urine, due to its ammonia content, was valued for its cleaning and bleaching properties. It was commonly used in laundries for clothes. Roman fullers already used it for this. And in some personal hygiene practices, although the resulting stench must have been, if anything, even more unpleasant than the body odor it was attempting to mitigate. Cleanliness was not understood as the elimination of germs, a science yet to be discovered, but as the visible removal of dirt and a desperate attempt to mask or reduce bad odor. Finally, we cannot overlook the impact of religious beliefs on the perception of bathing. While the Church did not explicitly prohibit bathing, and in certain contexts, such as the washing of feet on Holy Thursday or ritual ablutions, water had a spiritual meaning. The bathing culture of classical antiquity became associated in the Middle Ages with lust and promiscuity. Nudity was viewed with suspicion, and in some monastic or ascetic circles, bodily dirt was even interpreted as a sign of humility, detachment from worldly pleasures and piety. The purity of the soul was prioritized over that of the body. This, coupled with practical difficulty, contributed to bathing not being a cultural priority, but a practice relegated or even avoided by some. Friends who join me on this nocturnal journey into the bowels of the Middle Ages, if the subject of bathing has already seemed like a bleak panorama, prepare yourselves to delve into an even more intimate, and paradoxically, one of the dirtiest corners of medieval life: clothing. Forget the chimeras of immaculate tunics and flowing cloaks from the movies. In the smelly and tangible reality of that era, clothing was not just a protective layer against the cold or a symbol of status, but also a silent, yet extremely active nest of dirt, unspeakable odors, and a parasitic fauna that shared daily existence with every human being. Let's start with the fundamental question, which for the modern mind seems almost absurd. Washing clothes? What's that? For the vast majority of the medieval population, the idea of frequent washing of outer garments, and for many, even bedding, was simply alien. The notion of weekly laundry that we take for granted today, which we even complain about, was an unattainable utopia. Outer garments, such as tunics, doublets, cloaks, or mantles, could be worn for weeks or even months without seeing a drop of soapy water. Think of a peasant in rural France or an artisan in a crowded English city in the 13th century. Their work clothes, and often their daily wear, accumulated layers and layers of sweat, road dust, body grease, food scraps, and the inevitable splashes of life in an unsanitized environment. Bedding, while sometimes aired out, shaken, and straw mattresses changed sporadically, was rarely subjected to a thorough washing. Linen sheets, easier to wash, were a luxury for most, and even then, their cleanliness was not what it is today. The reason for this situation was not laziness, but a matter of sheer logistics and scarcity of resources. Washing clothes on a large scale was a colossal task. There were no washing machines, nor laundries with running water and drains. The entire process was manual and extremely laborious. Water had to be carried from wells, rivers, or springs, often considerable distances. Heating it required enormous amounts of firewood or charcoal, valuable and expensive resources, as we already saw with bathing. There were no modern detergents. Rudimentary methods were used. Clothes were vigorously beaten against rocks in rivers or streams, which, let's remember, could be contaminated with waste. They were scrubbed with sand for a rudimentary abrasion or immersed in alkaline solutions. Rudimentary lye, obtained from wood ashes, and ash leachate was the most common detergent, a caustic agent that, while helping to dissolve grease, was also aggressive to hands and fabrics. Some historical documents, such as washing instructions in abbeys or manor houses, describe the laundry process as a multi-day event requiring large cauldrons and the coordinated effort of several laundresses. In some cases, as is known from archaeological studies of Roman and medieval sites, communal washing tubs were used, or women gathered at rivers to wash clothes, also making it a social event. The problem was exacerbated by the predominant materials. The most common fabrics were wool and linen. Wool, while unbeatable for warmth, is notoriously difficult to clean thoroughly without modern processes. It tends to retain dirt, odors, and, worse, shrinks and deforms if washed with hot water and aggressively handled. Linen, lighter and more absorbent, was indeed the preferred fiber for garments in direct contact with the skin, as it was easier to wash and dry, and became softer with use. However, even linen required considerable effort, and the available methods did not guarantee deep cleaning or germ removal. Exposure to sun and air was a fundamental cleaner. Clothes were hung on hedges, fences, or rudimentary clotheslines to air out and deodorize, a practice that, although it could mitigate superficial odor, did not effectively kill bacteria, or, more critically, the parasites that had comfortably settled among the fibers. And this is the point that connects us most with the reality of dirt. Clothes not only accumulated visible grime, but became a true ecosystem for parasitic fauna. Lice, both head and body, fleas and bedbugs, found an ideal refuge in unwashed garments to live, reproduce, and feed on their human hosts. Medical chronicles of the time, although they did not understand disease transmission as we do, did mention the omnipresence of these companions with astonishing naturalness. For a medieval individual, having lice was not a sign of personal neglect or a sign of extreme poverty, but an inherently accepted part of life, a reality from which few escaped. Fleas, for example, were so common that it is known that flea traps were used, small containers with blood, or a sticky material that people carried under their clothes or placed near their beds. The absence of regular washing, constant body heat, and multiple folds of clothing offered a perfect environment for these insects to thrive unchecked, turning humans into mere ambulatory carriers. Finally, let's talk about underwear, a concept that, while it existed, was very different from what we conceive today. While in the wealthier classes men wore braies, a kind of loose linen shorts, and women wore chemises, long linen shirts, these garments were not always changed daily for the entire population. For the poorest, a single linen shirt was a valuable asset, and was worn until it disintegrated. This underwear, which had the most direct contact with the body, was washed more frequently than outer garments, often in small household basins. However, for most, the absence of a daily change or effective washing meant that sweat, bodily secretions, and fecal matter, given the precarious intimate hygiene, were in direct and constant contact with the skin, and therefore with outer garments that were rarely washed. This lack of a basic hygienic layer between the body and outer clothing exponentially increased dirt, body odors, and, more seriously, the risk of skin infections and the uncontrolled proliferation of parasites. Some studies suggest that the use of these linen layers, easier to wash and absorbent of sweat, was a conscious strategy to protect more expensive and difficult-to-clean wool garments, acting as a hygienic, albeit rudimentary, barrier. If we have so far only skimmed the surface of medieval filth, prepare yourselves, because now we are delving into the very epicenter of discomfort and risk. Body fauna. Those tiny inhabitants who not only shared every human body, but were such an inherent part of life that their presence was not an exception, but the rule. We are talking about a plague so omnipresent, so accepted, that its study reveals not only the lack of hygiene, but also a fascinating and disgusting window into the resilience and superstitions of an era. We refer, of course, to lice, fleas, bedbugs, and the myriad of other micro-invaders that made every person a walking ecosystem. The first and most brutal truth is their universal prevalence. It is vital to banish any notion that only the poor or the vagrants were infested. In the Middle Ages, let me be emphatic, absolutely everyone, from the humblest serf tilling the land to the queen in her brocade bed, harbored lice and fleas. It was not a stigma, but a shared existential condition. Archaeological excavations have unearthed fine knit combs at sites as diverse as noble castles and rural settlements, confirming the universality of the infestation. Texts from the time, such as monastery chronicles or the writings of the few doctors, mention these parasites with astonishing naturalness. For example, in the 13th century, the physician and naturalist Aldobrandino of Siena described lice as small creatures that inhabit the bodies of men and women and feed on blood and sweat. Imagine the scene in a royal court, a sumptuous banquet, lute music, But beneath the rich silk and velvet garments, itching was a constant companion. Even saints, in their quest for piety, sometimes embraced infestation as a sign of humility and mortification of the flesh, a detachment from the material world. The main reason for this widespread invasion was the almost total absence of effective textile hygiene and the lack of regular clothing changes. As we have already explored, garments were worn for weeks or months. These clothes became the perfect sanctuary for body lice, Pediculus humanus, which, unlike head lice, prefer to live in the seams and folds of clothing that are in direct contact with the skin, moving to the body only to feed. Fleas, for their part, jumped from rats and other animals to humans, and then found an ideal refuge in the fibers of clothing and in the dust of floors. Imagine this hypothetical situation. You are a merchant who has just arrived in Paris after weeks of travel. You have slept in infested inns with straw mattresses that are never washed and that harbor colonies of bedbugs, Cimex lectularius, which come out at night to feed on your blood. Your clothes, impregnated with sweat and dust, have not been washed since you left your home in Flanders. Entering a bustling tavern, you sit next to other travelers and locals. Unbeknownst to you, fleas jump from one to another, from the rat scurrying on the floor to your ankles, and head lice from your table neighbor to yours. The scene is invisible, but the infestation is constant. A network of parasitic life interconnected in every human interaction. The consequences of this forced coexistence were much more than a simple nuisance or the annoyance of an itch. Constant, chronic, and incessant itching led to permanent skin irritation. People scratched incessantly, often with dirty fingernails, opening the skin to a myriad of secondary infections. Pustules, boils, impetigo, a bacterial skin infection, and other skin conditions were endemic. These wounds, which today we would treat with a simple antiseptic, in the Middle Ages could lead to serious infections, debilitating fevers, and, ultimately, death in an era without antibiotics. Think of a medieval child, with their tender and susceptible skin, suffering these infestations from birth. Infant mortality, already extremely high, was exacerbated by these conditions. But the most devastating consequence of these bedfellows is that they were invisible vectors of deadly diseases. Fleas, and not the rat directly, are primarily responsible for the transmission of the Black Death. The rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopus, upon biting a rat infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis, would become infected itself. When the rat died, often by the thousands in cities before humans even noticed the epidemic, the flea would seek a new host, and that was the human. By biting the human, the flea would regurgitate the bacterium into the wound, inoculating the disease. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, eliminating an estimated 30% to 50% of the population, was a brutal testament to the lethal power of these tiny insects and the unsanitary conditions that facilitated their spread. Cities like Florence, Venice, or London, with their dense populations and precarious hygiene, became perfect breeding grounds. But the plague was not the only threat. Body lice, Pediculus humanus, which live in clothing and migrate to the skin, were the main culprits for transmitting epidemic typhus, caused by the bacterium Rickettsia prowazekii and relapsing fever. These diseases, although not as catastrophic as the Black Death, wreaked havoc in crowded populations, campaigning armies, and prisons. Soldiers, for example, who lived in extreme proximity and without the possibility of hygiene, were particularly vulnerable. Typhus epidemics could decimate an army more effectively than the enemy. Imagine a siege. Thousands of men huddled together, without water to wash, without clean clothes, weakened by malnutrition. Lice proliferated unchecked, and the disease spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of death and delirium. Faced with this reality of constant invasion, what anti-lice and anti-flea methods existed? They were as rudimentary as the rest of the hygienic practices, and often of dubious effectiveness. The most common was the fine comb, often carved from bone, wood, or ivory, with closely spaced teeth designed to drag out adult lice and, hopefully, nits from hair and beards. It was a tedious, daily, and communal practice. Family members combed each other, an act of care that today would seem strange to us. Constant scratching was the most immediate solution, though counterproductive due to the wounds it could cause. For more folkloric than effective purposes, some aromatic herbs were used, believed to repel insects, or small sachets with these herbs were placed under clothing. Some are known to have carried a piece of goat or other animal skin, thinking that the parasites would prefer that nest over their own skin. Flea traps, as already mentioned, were also used. Small containers with a sticky material or a little blood to attract insects. Paradoxically, some popular beliefs even attributed a certain meaning to lice. It was said that they were the blood of the poor, or that their presence was a sign of humility and resignation to divine will. Their elimination was not always a priority, sometimes due to the belief that dying with lice was a sign that your soul was in grace. An idea, without a doubt, that today seems chilling to us. So, as the silence of the night envelops us, and the image of these tiny invaders settles in our minds, we understand that body fauna was not just a nuisance for medieval people. It was a constant companion that contributed to chronic discomfort, irritation, and, ultimately, the spread of devastating epidemics that could wipe entire cities off the map. A grim and persistent reminder of why in the Middle Ages you would be infinitely infested, constantly scratching, and often at mortal risk. If we have so far painted a grim picture of medieval filth and parasites, prepare yourselves, because now we delve into the darkest and most terrifying core of that reality, the plague of squalor. Because every persistent stench, every louse inhabiting a body, every contaminated well, was not just an annoyance or an inconvenience, it was an open invitation, a red carpet for disease and death. In an era without knowledge of germs, without modern sanitation, dirt was not just a visible layer. It was a slow and constant poison, a silent architect of tragedy that relentlessly claimed lives. To understand this, allow me to introduce you to Thomas, the baker. Imagine Thomas, a man in his 30s, with flour-dusted hands and a back hunched from mornings in the oven. He lives in a small but bustling village in what would today be central England, in the 14th century, just before the great shadow of the Black Death loomed over Europe. His house, like most of his neighbors, is made of wood and wattle and daub with a thatched roof. The floor is packed earth, and the air, even indoors, is perpetually heavy with chimney smoke and the multiple odors of medieval rural life. Thomas's first battle against filth was fought every morning when fetching water. His well, the water source for his family and in part for his bakery, was dangerously close to the hole of his rudimentary latrine, a simple pit in the ground. Historically, there were no sanitary regulations. Human and animal waste accumulated in the streets or in shallow pits, inevitably seeping into the subsoil and, therefore, into the underground aquifers that fed the wells. Rains turned unpaved streets into muddy, fecal streams, dragging filth directly into rivers or fields. Think of London's Fleet Ditch, a river that became, by popular decree, an open sewer that drained directly into the Thames, a river from which people also drank. Thomas, our baker, knows this well. Every summer, without fail, summer fever or flux of the belly strikes his family. His youngest daughter, Ilara, once suffered from dysentery so severe that she was at death's door. He watched her waste away, with agonizing cramps and constant diarrhea, her tiny body weakened by dehydration. Thomas didn't know that the water he drew from his well, or even what he used for his bread, was contaminated with bacteria like Shigella or Salmonella typhi, which caused dysentery and typhoid fever. For him, it was a divine punishment, or simply bad luck, the bad air that came with the heat. Nor did he know that the flies, constantly buzzing in his small bakery, had just landed on piles of manure and street waste before landing on his bread dough or the cheese his wife kept for dinner. Cross-contamination in food handling was the norm. Hands were rarely washed, and the idea of food hygiene was a science fiction concept. The second major front of battle was spread by contact, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Thomas and his family coexisted, day and night, with an invisible but very active population of parasites. Flea bites were a constant nuisance, leaving red, itchy welts on their legs and arms. But the real terror came with body lice. One winter, his wife, Ilara, fell ill with a high fever and a strange rash. She had chills, muscle aches, and delirium that made her talk nonsense. It was epidemic typhus, a disease transmitted by the feces of lice when a person scratched the bite and introduced them into the wound. The disease spread rapidly in the crowded village houses, especially when people huddled together to keep warm in the cold winters, and laundry was even less frequent. Ilara fortunately survived, but many others in the village, especially the elderly and younger children, were not so lucky. Historically, typhus decimated entire armies. Charles V's army, for example, was ravaged by typhus during the siege of Naples in 1528, losing thousands of men. Lice, constant companions, became riders of death, and hovering over this reality, there was always the shadow of the Black Death. Although Thomas has not yet experienced it, his village is primed for it. Living conditions are its perfect breeding ground. Rats, carriers of infected fleas, run freely through Thomas's grain stores and the village streets, feeding on accumulated waste. The lack of sanitation did not directly cause the Black Death, but it was the catalyst that allowed the disease to spread with unprecedented ferocity when it arrived. In cities like Florence in 1348, where Boccaccio describes the terror in his Decameron, or London, the plague spread with terrifying speed, not because people were inherently dirty by choice, but because their environment was irremediably compromised. Finally, let's talk about wounds and infections. Thomas, as a baker, often cut his hands with knives or burned himself on the oven. Sometimes, walking through the village's dirt streets, he would step on a nail or a sharp bone. His treatment consisted of wrapping the wound with a cloth, often dirty, without any prior cleaning. There was no knowledge of antisepsis. Imagine the scene. A wound, however small, would turn red, swell, ooze pus. Fever would seize Thomas, and a chilling fear would run through his body. The threat of gangrene, the death of tissue due to infection, which often required horrible amputations performed by the village barber surgeon with unsterilized instruments, was a palpable reality. A simple scrape could end in the loss of a limb, or, more commonly, in septicemia, a generalized blood infection, which would lead to a slow and painful death. Skin infections, boils, and abscesses were so common that they barely warranted mention, unless they became severe. Other chronic diseases also found a fertile home. Tuberculosis, the Great White Plague, spread silently in small, damp, poorly ventilated, and crowded homes, where the cough of a sick person could easily infect an entire family. People slowly wasted away, with persistent fevers and a cough that wore them down. Thomas knew neighbors who suddenly began to cough blood and withered before his eyes. And in this bleak panorama, the perception of disease was as precarious as hygiene. For Thomas and most of his contemporaries, disease was not caused by invisible germs, but by miasmas, bad vapors in the air, by an imbalance of the humors in the body, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm, by the influence of the stars, or, more commonly, by divine punishment or the action of witches and demons. Faced with such a misunderstanding of the causes, the solutions were often useless. Prayers, processions, amulets, bloodletting that only weakened the patient, purges that dehydrated, or the use of herbs with no real effect against the cause of the disease. Thus, as the shadows of the night deepen and the complicit silence of these truths envelops us, understand that medieval filth was not a passive characteristic of the era. It was an active agent of destruction, one that killed slowly or quickly, but with implacable certainty, turning the lives of people like Thomas into a fragile balance on the abyss of disease. A final reminder of why, in the Middle Ages, you would be constantly sick, suffering without relief, and with a short life marked by pain and fear of the invisible. If the image of unwashed bodies and infested clothes has already sent a shiver down your spine, prepare for a revelation that will affect your very mouth and the way you perceive human interaction in the Middle Ages. Why, in that era, was the concept of a bright smile and fresh breath simply a chimera? Dental hygiene was an almost virgin territory, a battleground lost beforehand against decay, pain, and putrefaction. First, you have to understand that the tools we take for granted today simply didn't exist. Forget soft bristled toothbrushes, mint-flavored toothpaste, or dental floss. These inventions, which now seem so basic and essential to us, were centuries in the future. For the vast majority of the medieval population, teeth cleaning was limited, at best, to rudimentary and often abrasive solutions. Some might use wooden or bone toothpicks, as found in archaeological excavations, to try to remove food debris from between their teeth. Others would rub their teeth and gums with coarse linen cloths, or directly with their own fingers. The substances used, if any, were as abrasive as fine sand, wood ash, or even charcoal. While these methods could polish the surface and remove some visible tartar, they often damaged tooth enamel in the long term, scratching it and opening the door to more problems, while irritating the gums. Some rudimentary pastes mixed herbs like sage, mint, or parsley with honey or vinegar, but their effectiveness was more aromatic than cleansing. The medieval diet was also no ally of oral health. Although they lacked modern refined sugars, their diet was rich in coarsely ground grains, such as rye or barley, which often left fine starch particles and, worse, tiny fragments of millstone clinging to their teeth. This caused significant wear of tooth enamel exposing the softer and more vulnerable dentin. Bread, a universal staple, was dense and prone to getting stuck between teeth. Add to this the frequent consumption of honey, dried fruits, and, in the wealthy classes, wine and beer, which, although they did not have the sugar level of modern soda, contributed to acidity and plaque formation. The consequences of this dental neglect were devastating and, above all, agonizing. Cavities were omnipresent. A rotten tooth was not an exception, but the norm for any medieval adult, and even for many children. These untreated cavities progressed unchecked, reaching the dental pulp and causing acute infections and unbearable dental abscesses. Imagine the constant throbbing pain that pulsed with every heartbeat, the massive swelling of the face, the fever and chills that accompanied a dental infection without antibiotics. An abscess could burst, draining pus with a nauseating taste and smell into the mouth, or, more dangerously, spreading to the jawbones or even the brain, leading to systemic infections that could be lethal. Periodontal disease, gingivitis and periodontitis, was rampant, with inflamed, bleeding gums and constant recession leading to root exposure and eventual tooth loss from an early age. It was not uncommon for a 30 or 40-year-old adult to already have several missing teeth, affecting their ability to eat, and therefore, their nutrition. And here we come to the most revealing and perhaps most unpleasant point: medieval breath. With all these factors, decaying food remnants between teeth, inflamed and bleeding gums, oozing infections in the mouth and throat, the constant accumulation of bacterial plaque, and the general lack of bodily and digestive hygiene, the breath of medieval people must have been, by our standards, absolutely atrocious. We're talking about a constant and penetrating stench, a combination of severe halitosis, rotting food debris, and the smell of infection. It wasn't occasional bad breath. It was a constant, an integral part of the sensory environment of the time. There were no mint gums or effective mouthwashes. People were so accustomed to these smells, so immersed in them, that perhaps they did not perceive them with the same intensity as we would today. For them, it was simply the smell of a person, the smell of life itself. Let's now consider a historical example. Think of a renowned monarch, the formidable Edward III of England, known as Longshanks, or Hammer of the Scots, a powerful leader and warrior who reigned from 1272 to 1307. Although we have no records of his toothbrushing, because none existed, archaeological evidence and general knowledge of oral health in the Middle Ages tell us that even a king like Edward, despite his status and access to resources, suffered enormously from dental problems. Imagine this king, majestic on his throne, presiding over a council, leading a battle. Still, it is almost certain that this monarch suffered from painful cavities, inflamed gums, and, in all probability, recurrent abscesses. Forensic odontology and the study of skeletal remains of high-status individuals from the period reveal a high prevalence of severe cavities, periapical abscesses, infections at the tip of the tooth root, and considerable tooth loss, even in early and middle adulthood. Edward IV's toothache, although not recorded in detail, must have been a constant. A dull, throbbing pain that robbed him of sleep, affected his ability to eat, perhaps leading him to opt for broths and soft foods when his teeth prevented him, and undoubtedly affected his temperament and concentration on affairs of the kingdom. For a king, treatment options were only marginally better than for a peasant. Barber surgeons, who were often the only practitioners with the skill to extract a tooth, were not specialized dentists. Their tools were brutal, pelicans and dental keys. Instruments with a kind of claw or hook were used to leverage and pull teeth from the mouth with terrible force, all without anesthesia, save perhaps strong alcohol to intoxicate the patient. The process was traumatic, bloody, and often left the mouth even more vulnerable to infections. The risk of bone or jaw fracture was considerable. It is more than likely that Edward Bonfort himself, or some member of his court, underwent such cruel extractions. There was no healing, only the removal of the problem that caused the pain. In the realm of superstitions, people believed that the cause of cavities was dental worms. To kill them, sometimes herbal poultices were applied, or even substances were burned near the tooth, with the belief that the worms would come out. Some amulets and prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dental ailments, whose teeth were pulled out as martyrdom, were their only hopes for relief. So, as the night deepens and silence allows us to almost smell and feel the reality, reflect on the state of the medieval mouth, a mouth full of pain, infection, and, yes, breath that today we would consider a biological weapon. A reality that affected everyone, from the humblest subject to the most powerful king. Another step up the ladder of filth and suffering that was daily life in the Middle Ages. A final reminder of why, if you lived then, you would not only be dirty and plagued by parasites, but your mouth would be a constant source of pain and your breath a truly unforgettable experience, in the worst sense. If bathing and personal hygiene have already given us a difficult image to digest, prepare for an even more overwhelming, more omnipresent, and, in the long run, more lethal truth: waste management. Because in the Middle Ages, the city, the town, and even the countryside were, in essence, enormous open-air dumps. The complete absence of basic sanitary infrastructure and the lack of understanding about disease transmission turned every human settlement into a constant source of contamination, a ubiquitous stench that, invisibly, dictated the life and death of its inhabitants. The most vivid and nauseating image is that of streets as perpetual sewers. Forget clean sidewalks or trash collection systems. In medieval cities, the narrow and winding streets were the final destination for almost everything imaginable. Human and animal feces, from people, horses, pigs, dogs, and poultry that roamed freely, decomposing food scraps, entrails of animals slaughtered in improvised butcher shops, ashes from homes, mud and sludge generated by rain. Everything accumulated in thick layers. Streets were mostly unpaved. They were dirt roads that turned into sticky, foul-smelling quagmires with the slightest precipitation. Think of specific cities. In London, the famous Fleet Ditch was, from the 13th century, little more than an open sewer, described by chroniclers as a place of intolerable stench, where nothing but the filth of the city runs and piles up. Its waters, or what was left of them, flowed into the Thames, which, ironically, was also the main source of drinking water for many Londoners downstream. The so-called rakers, supposed trash collectors of London, could barely cope with the immense amount of waste generated daily. Their ox carts tried, unsuccessfully, to move the ever-growing piles of filth. Royal edicts prohibiting the dumping of trash or excrement into the streets, like that of Edward III in 1357, were largely ignored or unenforceable due to the lack of alternatives. The Blackfriars area, near the river, was notoriously famous for the smell of slaughterhouses and tanneries that dumped their organic waste and tanning water directly into the river. In Paris, the situation was no better. Streets like the notoriously infamous Rue Merderon, Shit Street, bore witness to the reality. King Philip II Augustus of France, in the late 12th century, ordered the paving of some of Paris's most important streets, not for aesthetics, but because of the unbearable mud and bad odors that turned them into impassable swamps of filth, especially near markets and butcher shops. But these were minimal improvements in a sea of dirt, and don't think that the dirt stayed only on the ground. The practice of emptying chamber pots and waste buckets out the window was as common as it was dangerous. The famous cry of Gardez-vous, Ayez garde, or beware of the water, was the only warning, and it was not always given, or given too late, before the contents of a chamber pot fell from an upper floor directly into the street, drenching any unsuspecting passer-by. This practice, omnipresent in overcrowded cities, was not only a source of humiliation and disgust, but it spread disease directly, creating a spray of pathogens in the air and on the surface of the streets. Chroniclers of the time, such as Jean Froissart, recount situations where nobles and commoners alike suffered these involuntary showers. Drainage systems, when they existed, were primitive, ineffective, and overwhelmed. Rudimentary cesspits were simple pits dug under houses, without impermeable lining. They filled up quickly and often overflowed, filtering their contents directly into the subsoil or into the basements of homes, creating an unbearable stench and attracting pests. Communal latrines or privies, places where people defecated into a hole leading to a pit or ditch, were massive sources of infection. And in castles and monasteries, guardrabes or overhanging latrines that projected from the walls simply deposited waste directly into the moat, river, or a dump at the foot of the wall, adding their contribution to the contamination of the immediate environment. And all this, where did it end up? Directly in the rivers. Rivers, far from being sources of life or beauty, were the natural drains of cities. The Seine in Paris, the Thames in London, the Arno in Florence, were literally receptacles for human and industrial waste. Slaughterhouses dumped entrails, dyers poured their chemical waste, such as urine and lime for treating hides, and every inhabitant contributed their own organic waste. This not only created an unbearable stench along the riverbanks, but it turned the water into a breeding ground for diseases. And what was more terrible, many downstream populations used that same water for drinking, washing clothes, or preparing food, perpetuating the cycle of disease. A study of skeletal remains in the St. Bride's Cemetery in London has shown that the city's inhabitants had extremely high rates of intestinal parasites, directly related to the intake of contaminated food and water. The consequences of this rudimentary waste management were palpable and deadly. The most evident was the constant and penetrating stench that dominated the urban environment. The air was saturated with a mixture of excrement, organic putrefaction, wood smoke, human and animal sweat, and effluvium from garbage. For the medieval citizen, that was the smell of the city, a normalized part of life. But beyond the olfactory discomfort that contributed to the miasma theory as a cause of disease, this accumulation of waste was the perfect magnet for attracting rodents and insects. Rats and mice swarmed in immense quantities, living and reproducing in piles of garbage, in granaries, and in house walls. These rodents were the primary carriers of infected fleas, such as those that transmitted the Black Death. Flies, which reproduced in manure, then landed on food and bodies, transmitting bacteria. Filth was not just a matter of aesthetics. It was a matter of survival. Let me illustrate this with the story of Agnes, the laundress. Agnes, a woman in her 40s living on the outskirts of a bustling commercial city, earns her living by washing clothes for wealthier families. Her day begins early, walking through the winding, muddy streets of the settlement, dodging puddles of unknown effluvia. The stench is so intense that it sometimes makes her nauseous, but she's used to it. Most days, someone shouts, "Gardaloo!" and Agnes must quickly jump aside, or risk being sprayed by the contents of a chamber pot. Falling from a window. She has often seen children playing carelessly among piles of garbage or in dirty puddles. Her workplace is the river that runs through the city, a river whose waters, further downstream, turn murky and brown, laden with waste from slaughterhouses, tanneries, and the latrines of houses and castles. Agnes immerses her hands in this cold and contaminated water for hours, beating clothes against the stones. Although she tries to rinse the clothes as best she can, she knows that the cleaning is superficial. She herself suffers from chronic skin irritations and rashes on her hands and arms caused by constant contact with dirty water and chemicals from the tanneries. But the suffering doesn't end there. Her young son, Finn, a boy of only 5, often suffers from impetigo, a bacterial skin infection that causes festering sores on his face and hands. Agnes knows that Finn plays near the open drainage ditches, and that the flies, which swarm in their small house, land on his food and skin. Agnes blames herself, thinking it's a divine punishment, or that she hasn't been careful enough, without knowing that the true cause is the environment in which they are forced to live, an environment where filth is an invisible condemnation. Finn's feverish nights, chills, and weakness are a constant reminder of the fragility of life in their world. Even attempts at regulation, such as ordinances in Nuremberg or Bruges, which stipulated the emptying of waste at certain times or at specific points, were difficult to apply in practice. The population was dense, means of waste transport were limited, and the mindset that waste simply disappeared or was washed away by rain prevailed. Thus, as the night envelops us and the image of these stinking, dangerous, and overcrowded cities settles in our minds, understand that waste management in the Middle Ages was not mere negligence. It was a sanitary time bomb, a brutal reminder of why, in that era, your life would be inseparably linked to filth, and every breath would expose you to the invisible architects of disease and death. When contemplating the Middle Ages, our imagination often betrays us. We think of nobles in their elaborate garments, and peasants in their coarse clothes, and modern logic compels us to believe that wealth equated to cleanliness. However, allow me to dismantle that illusion. Personal hygiene in the Middle Ages was such a monumental challenge that while the upper classes had more access to certain luxuries and amenities, the reality is that no social class truly escaped the clutches of filth as we understand it today. The difference was often in the presentation of dirt, not in its fundamental elimination. Grime was, in essence, the great social equalizer. If you're listening to me at this point in the video, I hope you've already subscribed to the channel. I'm Silent of History, and my wish is to have a huge community of people who love knights and knowledge. Thousands of people from all over the world, connected by that intrinsic desire to know more in order to know oneself better and have a better life. I always say and emphasize that knowing history is fundamental to avoid repeating past mistakes. And that's why I want you to take a few seconds to subscribe and share this video with your knowledge fanatic friend. Not to mention, if your generous spirit motivates you to give a super thanks to this humble servant. In any case, my gratitude for the simple fact of sharing this moment is infinite. Now, let's continue with the story. Let's start with the pinnacle of power and opulence, royalty and nobility. Think of the imposing figure of Isabella Wars of Castile, the Catholic queen, who reigned in the second half of the 15th century, a bridge between the High and Late Middle Ages. A woman of deep piety and discipline. A persistent and erroneous myth has circulated about her, that she only bathed twice in her life, at birth and before getting married. This is a black legend, probably fueled by later Protestant propaganda to denigrate Spanish Catholic monarchs as uncivilized. The reality is more nuanced, but equally revealing by our standards. Isabella I, like any noble of her time, did not bathe daily, but she did perform frequent ablutions. In her palaces and castles, there were rooms equipped with movable wooden tubs, which were filled with hot water, a costly and laborious process requiring firewood and servant labor. However, these full baths were infrequent events, perhaps weekly, every 2 weeks, or for special occasions. The water, once used, was not changed for each person, and aromatic herbs or salts were often added to make it more pleasant, not to clean it thoroughly. The true effort of the nobility was focused on masking odors and maintaining an appearance of neatness. The problem wasn't eliminated, it was concealed. Perfumed oils, distilled floral waters like rose, jasmine, or orange blossom, and pomanders were profusely used. These were small spheres of precious metals, gold, silver, containing aromatic mixtures like ambergris, musk, civet, cinnamon, cloves, which were held close to the nose to mitigate the ubiquitous stench of the environment and, yes, of their own bodies. The nobility's clothing, made of silks, velvets, and brocades, was extremely expensive and very difficult to clean. Therefore, it was refreshed by airing, brushing, and perfuming, but rarely thoroughly washed. The inner linen layers, shirts, chemises, were changed more frequently, perhaps every few days, as linen was easier to wash and absorbed sweat and grease, acting as a barrier between the body and the costly outer garments. However, this change of underwear did not imply exhaustive body cleaning. The atmosphere of a court, though outwardly splendid, must have been a complex symphony of exotic fragrances mixed with the persistent trace of unwashed humanity, of companion animals, and the inevitable stench of nearby sewers. Now, let's contrast this reality with that of common people, a peasant village in 12th century France. Think of a small settlement in the Languedoc region of southern France. Here, most of the population lived in simple houses of wood, mud, and thatched roofs, often sharing their living space with farm animals. For them, hygiene was a daily and desperate struggle against scarcity. Access to clean water meant a trip to the nearest spring or river, often contaminated. Heating water for a bath was an unattainable luxury, reserved only for the seriously ill or women in childbirth. Their daily hygiene was limited to washing their hands and face with cold, scarce water, often without soap, which was a costly commodity, a mixture of animal fat and ash lye. The body was cleaned with dry rubbing with coarse cloths. Clothes, usually 1 or 2 sets of wool or coarse linen, were worn until they disintegrated or fell apart. Washing was a communal and strenuous event in the river or in large tubs, using ash as a rudimentary detergent, with a frequency of weeks or months. Imagine a peasant working the land, covered in dust, sweat, mud, and manure. Their clothes, impregnated with these elements, became a perfect habitat for lice and fleas, a reality that was accepted as an inherent part of life. For them, a bath might be a quick dip in the river on a summer day, more for refreshment than for cleansing. The smell of a peasant village was a powerful and constant mixture of wood smoke, human and animal sweat, manure, mud, and stale food. This was their normal, a stench that permeated daily life. And amidst all this, hair hygiene was a universal challenge, regardless of birth. Long hair, in both men and women, was the norm and a perfect refuge for head and body lice. Hair washing was infrequent. Water, or sometimes ash lye, was used for cleaning, which was aggressive for the scalp and hair. For the noble classes, aromatic powders of lily, lavender, jasmine were sprinkled in the hair to absorb grease and impart a more pleasant aroma. Fine combs of ivory or bone were also used to try to remove lice and nits. Women, especially, covered their hair with veils and coifs, a practice that helped contain and hide dirt and parasites while being considered a sign of modesty. Interesting fact: while Western cleanliness drastically declined after the fall of the Roman Empire, which had complex public baths, in the medieval Islamic world, personal and public hygiene, inspired by religious precepts, maintained much higher standards. Cities like Cordoba or Baghdad had public baths, hammams, with running water and sophisticated drainage systems, in contrast to most Christian European cities. This difference is a testament to how culture and knowledge profoundly influence public health. Thus, as the shadows of the night envelop us, and silence allows us to almost perceive the complex odors of the Middle Ages, we understand that differences in personal hygiene between social classes were, fundamentally, differences of degree, not of kind. Everyone lived in a world where dirt was the norm, and solutions were more palliative than curative. A brutal reminder of why in that era your social status would not save you from being constantly dirty, foul-smelling, and highly likely to have your body and head full of unwanted small inhabitants. The Middle Ages was, without a doubt, an exercise in resilience in the face of a filth that today would seem unbearable to us. If sedentary life in the Middle Ages was already an exercise in tolerance for filth, allow me to take you to the roads and inns, because on a journey, everything that was precarious in daily life was amplified to unimaginable limits. Hygiene, far from improving with movement, descended to a zero level that turned every journey into a test of endurance against accumulated dirt, parasites, and, almost inevitably, disease. Traveling in the Middle Ages was an act of bravery or desperation, but never one of comfort or cleanliness. Let's start with the infrastructure itself, the state of medieval roads. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the vast and organized network of Roman roads had catastrophically deteriorated. What remained were, for the most part, dirt paths, often narrow, winding, and full of deep potholes created by the incessant passage of carts, pack animals, and pedestrians. In winter or spring, these roads became swamps of thick mud, where boots sank and carts got stuck, soaking everything with dampness and sticky dirt. In summer, the mud dried and pulverized, creating a constant, blinding dust cloud that clung to clothes, hair, skin, and penetrated every body cavity. The air breathed by the traveler was saturated with this dust, mixed with the detritus of the thousands of animals that passed through: horses, oxen, sheep, and pigs, leaving behind copious amounts of manure that mixed with the mud or dust, adding an olfactory and biological layer to the dirt. The lack of access to clean water was a constant torment. Wells on the roads were scarce, and if they existed, they were often contaminated by runoff from the roads themselves or by proximity to human and animal waste sites. Rivers and streams might seem an option, but as we have already seen, many were already corrupted by populations upstream. Carrying enough potable water for a journey of several days or weeks was a heavy and impossible burden. The thirsty and exhausted traveler was forced to drink water of dubious origin or resort to beer or wine. And speaking of waste, open-air defecation was the norm on the roads. Travelers simply moved to the side of the path to relieve themselves, which turned the verges and shoulders into an extension of city sewers, contributing to large-scale contamination. Every bush, every hedge along the road was a potential source of infection. Now, let's think about the end of the day. Spending the night in inns and hospices. The medieval traveler, covered in dust or mud, exhausted and aching, sought refuge. But inns, far from being an oasis of cleanliness, were true crucibles of filth and disease. Private rooms were an extreme and very expensive luxury, reserved for high-ranking nobles. The vast majority of travelers slept in communal dormitories, often in the same room with other travelers, sometimes even sharing the same bed, pallet beds or straw mattresses, with strangers. Physical contact was inevitable, and with it, the transmission of all kinds of plagues. Straw or hay mattresses were rarely, if ever, changed. They were perfect nests for a myriad of parasites. Bedbugs, Cimex lectularius, similar in size to an apple seed and known for their linear bites, emerged under the cover of night from cracks in bed frames or from the folds of mattresses to feed. Their red, unbearably itchy bites and the small blood stains they left on the sheets, if any, were a constant. Head and body lice, and human and animal fleas, which often coexisted in inns or adjacent stables, were transmitted with alarming ease from host to host, ensuring that no one escaped infestation. The simple act of lying down in an inn bed was an open invitation to become the new home of thousands of insects. The lack of sanitation in these inns was obvious. Primitive latrines, often a hole into a cesspit, or simply a designated outdoor area that was irregularly emptied, and the total absence of hand-washing facilities for guests. The air in the inns, a mixture of sweat, stale beer, chimney smoke, and the effluvium of the latrines, was heavy and oppressive. Finally, let's talk about the traveler's food and drink. Food carried for the road was, by necessity, dry and durable. Hard bread, hardtack. Dried meats, like jerky. Cured cheeses, dried fruits. Although less prone to rapid putrefaction, its handling was not hygienic, and it could still become contaminated. In inns, food was a risk. Stews and soups, which were the most common dishes, were made with available ingredients, often meat that was no longer fresh and was cooked slowly for hours or even reheated for days. Strong spices were used to mask the taste of spoiled meat. The handling of these foods by unwashed hands, exposure to flies and dust, and proximity to animals in the inn made every meal a potential source of gastrointestinal diseases. Dysentery, the flux, was a plague so common that it was almost an expected part of the journey. Constant diarrhea and vomiting led to dehydration and weakness, making every step an agony and death a real possibility far from any help. Drinks were a dilemma. Water was dangerous, so beer or wine were the preferred beverages, not for refined taste, but because the fermentation process made them bacteriologically safer. However, even these could be poorly fermented, served in unwashed jugs, or stored in unsanitary barrels, causing their own problems. To illustrate this ordeal, let's think of an emblematic figure. Geoffrey Chaucer, the celebrated author of the Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century. Chaucer, a bureaucrat, diplomat, and poet, made numerous journeys in his life, including possible pilgrimages, and his masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales, is precisely built on the journey of a group of pilgrims from London to Canterbury, a route of about 100 kilometers that took several days. Imagine Chaucer himself, or one of his archetypal pilgrims, like the clerk or the wife of Bath, embarking on this journey. The road would be full of mud in spring or blinding dust in summer. Their clothes would be soaked with sweat and impregnated with dirt. Their feet, inside heavy leather boots, would redden and blister. At dusk, they would seek an inn. There, in a communal dormitory, they would lie on an infested straw mattress, feeling the constant bites of bedbugs and fleas. The stench of unwashed bodies, stable and stale beer would fill the air. Stomachs would churn with dinner, a greasy meat stew of dubious origin, the persistent cough of a bedmate, the incessant itching, the constant threat of the flux that could force them to stop at any moment by the side of the road, the lack of sleep due to bites and stomach pain. The medieval breath of their companions would be a constant reminder of proximity and lack of hygiene. This scenario is not an exaggeration. Travelers, whether merchants, pilgrims, or soldiers, were the main vectors of epidemics. Diseases like the Black Death or typhus traveled precisely along these routes, from inn to inn, from city to city, carried by the bodies of travelers who were unwitting hosts to pathogens. Thus, as the night envelops us and silence becomes charged with the image of these hardships, understand that traveling in the Middle Ages was not a romantic adventure, but an ordeal of discomfort, pain, and constant risk of disease. The road was not just a means to reach a destination. It was, in itself, a test of endurance against the zero level of hygiene that awaited at every step, an experience that marked the body and spirit of the traveler. Now, the inevitable and most crucial question is, how did they endure all this? How did they live day after day in a world that, for our modern noses, would be a constant assault, an unbearable olfactory torture? The answer lies in a fascinating and fundamental phenomenon: the normalization of bad odor. The people of the Middle Ages, from birth to death, were immersed in a sensory environment saturated with smells that today we would consider overwhelming, nauseating, and frankly unhygienic. The air of their cities and towns was a perpetual mixture of the pungent stench of human and animal feces accumulating in the streets, often overflowing cesspits and fields. Think of London's gong farmers, men who, under the cover of night, emptied latrines and cesspits, one of the most unpleasant professions of the time, whose stench spread for miles. Or the thousands of times chamber pots and piss pots were emptied directly from windows onto the street. The sickly sweet and nauseating smell of organic putrefaction, decomposing food scraps in markets, small animal carcasses in ditches, entrails discarded by butchers, the acrid and penetrating aroma of human and animal urine, the dense and suffocating smell of wood smoke and coal from chimneys, mixed with the stench of human and animal sweat. And, crucially, the specific odors of urban industries. Tanneries, often located near rivers, used urine, lime, and animal manure to process hides, releasing a stench that, according to chroniclers, was so potent it could be detected miles away. Butcher shops left blood and offal in the streets, and leather tanneries and wool dyers dumped their wastewater, laden with organic chemicals and strong odors, directly into waterways or streets. In this incessant sensory bombardment, a phenomenon known as olfactory adaptation occurs. The human brain has a remarkable ability to filter out constant stimuli. What might initially be shocking or unpleasant eventually becomes part of the sensory landscape, relegated to the background. Thus, what we would perceive as an unbearable and overwhelming stench was for a peasant, an artisan, or even a medieval noble, simply the smell of life, the smell of the city, the smell of a person. They didn't have a clean point of reference comparable to ours. Their baseline was completely different. Their noses were, by necessity, desensitized to the intensity of odors that would make us flee today. For them, a particularly strong and nauseating odor might indicate the presence of extreme putrefaction or death. But general body odor and the foul-smelling environment were not necessarily a cause for constant alarm or discomfort. The absence of odor was not sought, but rather the mitigation or superposition of more pleasant fragrances. And this leads us to the second point: the use of perfumes and herbs to mask, not eliminate. Medieval people understood that unpleasant odors existed, but their solution was not deep hygiene or sanitation. It was a strategy of olfactory deception, of layering. Royal courts and the high nobility invested fortunes in perfumes. In Elizabethan England, in the late 16th century, but inheriting these medieval practices, the Queen was famous for her passion for perfumes and perfumed gloves. Her court, and those of other European monarchs like the kings of France, were known for being saturated with potent and exotic fragrances extracted from the East: musk, civet, ambergris, benzoin. These substances, often of animal origin and with very intense odors, were mixed with floral distillates such as rosewater or orange blossom. They were applied directly to the skin and clothes and carried in small decorated receptacles, pomanders, which contained spices and aromatic resins. These were held near the nose to filter the air or hung from belts, projecting a cloud of fragrance around the wearer. They were symbols of status as much as an olfactory barrier. Practices also included the use of aromatic herbs to perfume rooms and clothes. The floors of castles and houses were often covered with perfumed rushes or fresh herbs like mint, sweet rush, or lavender, which released their aroma when trodden upon and helped absorb spills, in addition to serving to deter fleas. Cloth bags filled with dried lavender and other herbs were kept in clothing chests. Incense and myrrh in churches not only had a ritual or spiritual purpose, they also served to mask the stench of large congregations, many people in a closed space without ventilation or personal hygiene, and possibly that of garments or altars that were not regularly washed. The result of all this was a complex and often contradictory olfactory cacophony. A noble might smell of musk and roses, but beneath those layers, the smell of sweat from a body unwashed for days or weeks, of hair grease, and of aired but never truly clean clothes would still be present. The contradiction was noticeable to us, but for them, it was the norm. This perception of odor also connected directly with the miasma theory that prevailed in medieval medicine. It was believed that diseases were not transmitted by germs, invisible microorganisms, but by miasmas, toxic vapors or bad odors that emanated from decomposing matter, sick bodies, garbage, swamps. This meant that, although they correctly identified that foul-smelling places were associated with disease, their solution was not deep cleaning or sanitation, but ventilation or the use of perfumes to purify the air. Hence, plague doctors wore their famous bird beak masks, filled with aromatic herbs, believing that the smell of the herbs would protect them from the bad air carrying the disease. Large bonfires were lit in public squares during epidemics, with the hope that the heat and smoke would purify the atmosphere. Vinegar, due to its strong smell and ascetic properties, was profusely sprayed in the air and on objects, believing it cleaned the environment. Although smoke could deter some insects and aromas temporarily mask the stench, these practices had no real impact on viruses, bacteria, or parasites. They simply offered a false sense of security and control. All these solutions, from amulets to excrement concoctions and purifying fires, were, for the most part, useless from a modern medical perspective, and some, frankly, even harmful. However, it is crucial to understand that they were not acts of voluntary ignorance, but desperate responses from people who were genuinely trying to survive and make sense of a world where disease was a terrifying and incomprehensible force. They offered vital psychological comfort, a sense of agency in a world where death and affliction were constant companions. Their desperation was not a sign of stupidity, but the tragic result of a lack of fundamental knowledge. Thus, as the night deepens and silence becomes charged with the aroma of burning herbs, whispered prayers, and the inescapable underlying stench, understand that medieval solutions to dirt and disease were a poignant mixture of blind faith, distorted popular wisdom, and the crude need to cling to something amidst despair. It is the tragic story of humanity fighting an invisible enemy without the right weapons, and who, in its naivete, often did more harm than good, but never stopped fighting. In the Middle Ages, the plague smelled, and they were simply used to it. If life in the Middle Ages was already a challenge to survival, for children, it was a true biological lottery. The figure is cold and cruel. A significant portion of medieval children, often between 30% and 50%, did not survive beyond 5 years of age, and of those who did, many did not reach adolescence. This chillingly high infant mortality rate was the result of multiple factors, but the lack of hygiene was, undoubtedly, the primary and most insidious cause. Hygiene in medieval childhood was a practically non-existent concept, and every stage of a baby's and young child's life was plagued with health risks. The main causes of infant death were diarrheal diseases, dysentery, cholera, respiratory infections exacerbated by unsanitary conditions, and skin infections that could quickly lead to sepsis. Think of diapers and baby clothes. Forget modern disposable diapers, or even the absorbent cloth ones we know today. In the Middle Ages, babies were wrapped in precarious rags, often simply old, worn pieces of linen. Wool. These rags were minimally absorbent, and worse, were rarely changed with the necessary frequency. The scarcity of clean, hot water, the absence of effective soap, and the immense daily work of mothers and caregivers meant that these dirty diapers remained in contact with the baby's skin for hours, sometimes for days. The consequences of this practice were devastating. Babies suffered constant skin irritations and infections, severe rashes, painful ulcerations, and bacterial outbreaks like impetigo or cellulitis that could spread rapidly. The baby's skin, constantly in contact with urine and feces, became a gateway for pathogens. Furthermore, the baby's hands, which naturally explored their body, became dirty with their own feces and were then brought to their mouth, creating an uninterrupted cycle of fecal-oral transmission of diseases. The smell of unwashed babies and dirty diapers was an omnipresent component of the environment in any home with young children, so normalized that it was barely perceived as anomalous. Beyond diapers, contaminated food and water were a second front of vulnerability. While breastfeeding offered crucial initial protection against water and foodborne diseases, once the baby began the weaning phase, the risk dramatically soared. Babies began consuming solid and liquid foods prepared in an environment where hygiene was non-existent. Water used to mix gruel or dilute animal milk came from wells or communal sources that, as we have already explored, were almost always contaminated by runoff or waste. Food preparation was done with unwashed hands on dirty surfaces, and food was exposed to flies and general household dust. Feeding utensils, rudimentary wooden spoons, hollowed-out animal horns, or even rags for drinking, were impossible to sterilize and became vehicles for contamination. Animal milk, cow, goat, or sheep, often unpasteurized and obtained from animals that might be sick, was stored in unwashed containers, and its handling introduced new avenues of infection. Young children, in their oral exploration stage, constantly put their dirty fingers, unwashed wooden toys, or any object they found on the dirt floor of their homes into their mouths, a floor that was a true ecosystem of bacteria and parasites. The consequences of this lack of hygiene were devastating and visible. Many children suffered from chronic diarrhea, leading to severe dehydration and malnutrition. This weakness made them susceptible to a host of other infections: bronchitis, pneumonia, exacerbated by chimney smoke and cold in homes, and intestinal parasites that stole vital nutrients. Pale children, with sunken eyes, skin sores, and stunted growth, were a common sight. Infant mortality was not an isolated event, but a constant reality, an expected part of life, lamented but often attributed to divine will or the child's inherent weakness, without understanding the direct connection to the unsanitary environment. And so, friends who have accompanied me to the end of this nocturnal journey, we reach the conclusion of our immersion in medieval hygiene. We have traversed the filthy streets, the infested inns, the putrid battlefields, and the lives of those who, from royalty to peasantry and the most vulnerable childhood, dealt day by day with a reality that challenges our modern understanding of cleanliness. What we have unveiled is not a mere historical curiosity. It is a forceful reaffirmation that the Middle Ages, in terms of hygiene, was brutally different from anything we know. Diseases spread unchecked, odors were an overwhelming constant, and life, for many, was a constant struggle against filth and its lethal consequences. There was no concept of germs, nor of sanitation, nor of daily personal cleanliness as we understand it. Survival was, to a large extent, a matter of biological resistance and an astonishing capacity to adapt to conditions that today would seem uninhabitable to us. This stark contrast with the present must lead us to value the immense importance of modern hygiene and the advances we have achieved. Every daily shower, every hand washing, every sewage system, every clean hospital are the result of centuries of learning and a scientific understanding that for medieval people would have been pure magic. Our current standards are not a trivial luxury, but fundamental pillars of our health, our comfort, and our life expectancy. Therefore, my final message is critical and direct. We must not idealize the past. The Middle Ages, despite its castles and knights, was a dirty, uncomfortable, and dangerously unhealthy time. It was an era where life was shorter, and disease a constant shadow. It's easy to romanticize it from a distance, but the reality was an immense sensory and physical challenge. So, after all we've shared under the cloak of night, will you think twice before complaining about your daily shower? What fact surprised you the most or turned your stomach? I invite you to reflect on it. I hope you enjoyed this story and that it helped you relax while listening to some good history. This is Silent of History, your faithful companion for your sleepless nights. If you liked the story, please give it a good like and subscribe to become part of this nocturnal and cultured community. Thanks for listening. Until the next adventure.